Thanks again for joining me here at But Now Ministry ORG. And as we continue our study of who is the creator of heaven and earth. That's right, we're going to pose that question because a lot of people don't know. And I'm going to tell you right now, it's not Charles Darwin, okay? It's not the Big Bang. Nothing went bang, okay, and then there it was. You know, maybe if you go outside and throw some dirt in the air, you know, maybe something will appear, but it ain't going to happen, okay? Louis Pasteur, 1822 to 1895, was another genuine scientist in the process of studying fermentation. He performed his famous 1861 experiment in which he disproved the theory of spontaneous generation. Life cannot arise from non-living materials. And like I told you in the beginning of this study with evolution, they said dirt plus dirt equals, let me see if I can go back and find it. Dirt plus dirt, oh right here, dirt plus water plus time equals living creatures. That's the evolutionary formula for making life. And the evolutionary formula for making a universe is nothing plus nothing equals 2 elements. Plus time equals 92 natural elements. So let me ask you something. Does 0 plus 0 equal 2? Isn't that nothing plus nothing? I don't know. Can't make this stuff up. And people actually believe this? Life cannot arise from non-living materials. This experiment was very important, for up to that time, a majority of scientists believed in spontaneous generation. They thought that if a pile of old clothes were left in a corner, it would breed mice. How about that? The proof was that, upon later returning to the clothes, mice would frequently be found there. Pasteur concluded from his experiment that only God could create living creatures, but modern evolutionary theory continues to be based on that outdated theory disproved by Pasteur. Spontaneous generation. Life arises from non-life. Why? Because it is the only basis on which evolution could occur. How about that? As Adam notes, with spontaneous generation discredited by Pasteur, biologists were left with no theory of the origin of life at all. And that was in 1967 on page 585 of J. Edison Adams' Plants, An Introduction to Modern Biology. So what happened? Why didn't anybody believe that? Why is it still in our history books, right? August Friedrich Leopold Weissman, born 1834, died 1914, was a German biologist who disproved Lamarck's notion of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And if you don't know who Lamarck is, we're going to get into that. That's where Darwin stole his theory from, okay? He is primarily remembered as the scientist who cut off the tails of 901 young white mice in 19 successive generations. Yet each new generation was born with a full-length tail. The final generation, he reported, had tails as long as those originally measured on the first. Weissman also carried out other experiments that buttressed his refutation of Lamarckism. His discoveries, along with fact that circumcision of Jewish males for 4,000 years had not affected the foreskin, doomed the theory. And that's what Gene Rostin in the Orion Book of Evolution in 1960 on page 64 said. Yet Lamarckism continues today as the disguised basis of evolutionary biology. For example, evolutionists still teach that giraffes kept stretching their necks to reach higher branches so their necks became longer. In a later book, Darwin abandoned natural selection as unworkable and returned to Lamarckism as the cause of the never observed change from one species to another. That you will find in Randall Hedke's The Secret of the Sixth Edition in 1984. In the first edition of his book, Darwin regarded natural selection and survival of the fittest as different concepts. By the sixth edition of his Origin of the Species, he thought they meant the same thing. How about that? But that survival of the fittest was the more accurate. In a still later book, The Descent of Man in 1871, Darwin ultimately abandoned natural selection as a hopeless mechanism and returned to Marxism. Even Darwin recognized the theory was falling to pieces. The supporting evidence just was not there. And everyone believes Charles Darwin? He even admitted it was hopeless. Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, was born into wealth and able to have life of ease. He took 2 years of medical school at Edinburgh University and then dropped out. It was the only scientific training he ever received. Because he spent the time in bars with his friends, he barely passed his courses. Darwin had no particular purpose in life, and his father planned to get him into a nicely paid job as an Anglican minister. Darwin did not object, but an influential relative got him a position as the unpaid naturalist on a ship planning to sail around the world, the Beagle. The voyage lasted from December 1831 to October 1836. So you're looking at about 5 years, right? It is of interest that after engaging in Spiritism, certain men in history have been seized with a deep hatred of God and have been guided to devise evil teachings that have destroyed large numbers of people, while others have engaged in warfare which have annihilated millions. In connection with this, we think of such known spiritists as Sigmund Freud and Adolf Hitler. Oh! And you're worried about who the president is? It is not commonly known that Charles Darwin, while a naturalist aboard the Beagle, was initiated into witchcraft in South America by nationals. During horseback travels into the interior, he took part in their ceremonies, and as a result, something happened to him. Upon his return to England, although his health was strangely weakened, he spent the rest of his life working on theories to destroy faith in the Creator. After leaving South America, Darwin was on a Galapagos island for a few days. While there, he saw some finches which had blown in from South America and adapted to their environment, producing several subspecies. He was certain that this showed cross-species of evolution, change into new species, but they were still finches. This theory about the finches was the primary evidence of evolution he brought back with him to England. Darwin, never a scientist and knowing nothing about the practicalities of genetics, then married his first cousin, which resulted in all 7 of his children having physical or mental disorders. One girl died after birth, another at 10. His oldest daughter had a prolonged breakdown at 15. 3 of his children became semi-invalids, and his last son was born mentally retarded and died 19 months after birth. His book, Origin of the Species, was first published in November 1859. The full title, On the Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, reveals the viciousness of the underlying concept. This concept led directly to the two of the worst wars in the history of mankind. And if you're wondering where racism comes from, here it is. In his book, Darwin reasoned from theory to facts and provided little evidence for what he had to say. Modern evolutionists are ashamed of the book with its ridiculous arguments. Why are we still teaching it? Why did we lose the Scopes monkey trial in 1920? Look that up. Darwin's book had what some men wanted, a clear-cut, in the open, current statement in the favor of species change. So, in spite of its laughable imperfections, they capitalized on it. Here is what you will find in his book. Darwin would cite authorities that he did not mention. He repeatedly said it was only an abstract and a fuller edition would come out later. But although he wrote other books, try as he may, he never could find the proof for his theories. No one since has found it either. When he did name an authority, it was just an opinion from a letter. Phrases indicating the hypothetical nature of his ideas were frequent. It might have been maybe, probably. I love those words. I love when preachers use those words. It probably was. It maybe could have been. That's not an absolute truth. It is conceivable that a favorite of his was, let us take an imaginary example. How about that one? Darwin would suggest a possibility and later refer back to it as a fact. As we have already demonstrated previously, elsewhere he would suggest a possible series of events and then conclude by assuming that proved the point. He relied heavily on stories instead of facts. Confusing examples would be given. He would use species and devious arguments and spent much time suggesting possible explanations while the facts he needed were not available. Here's an example of his reasoning. To explain the fossil trans-species gaps, Darwin suggested that species must have been changing quickly in other parts of the world where men had not yet examined the strata. Later, these changed species travel over to the Western world to be found in strata there as new species. So species were changing on the other side of the world, and that was why species in the process of change were not found on our side. How would he know that if he was never on that side of the world? With thinking like this, who needs science, right? But remember that Charles Darwin had very little science instruction. And that's the other thing. Here is Darwin's explanation of how one species changes into another. It is a variation of Lamarck's theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics. And you find this in Nicholas Hutton III's Evidence of Evolution, page 138, and that's from 1962, calling it pangenesis, okay? Darwin said that an organ affected by the environment would respond by giving particles that he called gemmules. These particles supposedly help determine hereditary characteristics. The environment would affect an organ, gemmules would drop out of the organ, and the gemmules would travel to the reproductive organs where they would affect the cells. W. Stansfield, Science of Evolution, 1977, page 38. As mentioned earlier, scientists today are ashamed of Darwin's ideas. In his book, Darwin taught that man came from an ape, and that the stronger races, is this racist? Within a century or two, destroy the weaker ones. Modern evolutionists claim that man and ape descended from a common ancestor. After taking part in the witchcraft ceremonies, not only was his mind affected, but his body also. He developed a chronic and incapacitating illness and went to his death under a depression he could not shake. And that you get from Random House Encyclopedia, 1977, page 768. He frequently commented in private letters that he recognized that there was no evidence for his theory and that it could destroy the morality of the human race. Isn't that interesting? Where are our morals today? Long before the reader has arrived at this part of my work, a crowd of difficulties will have occurred to him. Some of them are so serious that to this day I can hardly reflect on them without in some degree becoming staggered. That's what Charles Darwin said in Origin of the Species in 1860 on page 178, quoted from Harvard Classics, volume 11 in 1909. Often a cold shudder has run through me, and I have asked myself whether I may have not devoted myself to a fantasy. Charles Darwin, Life and Letters, 1887, volume 2, he says this on page 229. This fantasy of evolution also reminds me of the fantasy of the Sinaiticus Vaticanus text. And we will get to that the next time when we continue our study. Thanks again for joining me here. If you have any doctrinal questions, please email me from my website at preachingthegospeldhatsaves.com. If you have not yet, if this station has helped you at all, please subscribe to this YouTube station and also subscribe to my other YouTube station, which you can find on my website at preachingthegospeldhatsaves.com. If you have not, please subscribe to my bookstore blog where we compare various translations to that of God's perfect words, the 1769 King James Bible. God's perfect words without one error. And if you have not yet, and I posted new material, check out my study on Ephesians. And get ready, because we're going to fly through Ephesians and we're going to start going through Romans, dispensationally considered from God's perfect words, our 1769 King James Bible.